They're incompetent and they don't know how to count. Well, Jacob Zuma doesn't know how to count, but Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma apparently does.
I've been told that I need to remind everybody to like or subscribe or hit the little bell thingy. Don't know what the little bell thingy is, but hit the little bell thingy. That's apparently the YouTube thing to do.
I'm considering the unusual death rate because it's come up a couple of times in the last few weeks. What is an unusual death? We're sitting at 155,000 unusual deaths in South Africa. What the hell is an unusual death? Well, firstly, it's actually an unexpected death. Usually we expect about 1,300 to 1,600 deaths a day, or approximately 10,000 deaths a week, which takes us to approximately 550 to 600,000 deaths every single year in South Africa. We've got 154 or 155 to 160,000 more deaths than expected since May 2020. Where are these deaths? Why are these deaths happening? Some people want to consider that it's because many of the COVID deaths are not being recorded. Now, the first time I spoke about this was in July last year, when the figures came out that between the middle of May and the end of June, there were 40,000 unusual deaths that they couldn't explain. And there were considerations as to what they were. We knew that at that point in time, there was no ways that it was a COVID specific thing, because there weren't that many COVID cases that were happening to warrant 40,000 extra deaths. But now that it's spread out, there is that question, and some people want to consider, and I think it's fair to consider, that perhaps there's underreporting. Now, if there's underreporting, there's only two possible reasons. Either they don't know about the deaths and they are not able to handle this thing properly, it's incompetence, or they do know about the deaths, they're just not reporting it, and that's a major, major problem. Now, the one problem that I have with saying that it's just underreporting is that, on the one hand, I'm saying to people, listen, we got to ask questions about what's happening. Do the government know what they're doing, etc.? And every time I ask those questions, I'm called a conspiracy theorist. But it's interesting that the same people who call any questions a conspiracy are now saying, oh, well, the only reason there's these excess deaths is for no other reason that they're undercounting, because they're incompetent. And I want to just say that you can't win both sides of that argument. It's not coherent. You can't, on the one hand, object to me saying we need to question the government. We need to consider that they aren't exactly on top of what they're doing. There might be a bit of incompetence. There might even be a bit of tyranny there. And then shout me down. And at the same time, when it comes to this, because it suits your argument now, say, oh, well, they're actually just incompetent. It's merely that we've got too many COVID deaths and they're not reporting it. Well, that's the first problem with your argument. The second problem with that argument that I have is that if it is the case that it's actually 155,000 COVID deaths and not just 52,000, we are then sitting at 15 times more aggressive than the flu, more deadly than the flu, killing 15 times more people than the flu, and we're the only country in the world that's giving those records, when the actual count of the 52,000 is pretty much consistent with the rest of the world. We're then looking at approximately 3 times more dangerous the flu, which is exactly the same measure as the international figure for the year of 2020. So I think it's only fair to consider that there is something else that's causing these excess deaths, and there's actually evidence to support it, and this is the evidence. Number one, suicide call centers used to get 600 calls a day. They're now getting in excess of 1,400 calls a day. So if they're getting 1,000, more than double the amount of calls, it might be that there's more than double the amount of suicides. We don't have those numbers published yet, but we can expect that the suicide number will have increased in 2020 to 2021. I know people who've committed suicide. One very close friend personally, I know, who committed suicide in lockdown. Then the second reason is that the domestic violence call centers are also, and I'm getting this from SABC and radio stations and news, this is not made up, the domestic violence call centers received 120,000 calls, also more than double in the first 3 weeks of the first lockdown, and that has persisted. And the police stats came out, and the domestic murder rate has increased. We've got more deaths on suicides, more deaths on murders than what we used to have in 2019. And it's in the lockdowns, and it's because of the measures of the lockdowns in terms of preventing the disease, that those two categories are aggravated by the lockdowns, and more deaths are happening. The third area is that statistically it is showing around the world, not just in South Africa, all of this is around the world, by the way, that people are not getting medical treatment when they would get it before, and it has caused excess deaths. The measures of lockdown and forcing the hospitals to refuse certain categories of patients under certain guidelines, and those not being 100% clear. I know somebody who went to hospital for treatment, didn't get it, died the next day. They were given a pill and sent home because of the fear of spreading the disease. And then the fourth category of things which I know are causing more deaths than what they normally do is people are scared to go to hospital in lockdown when the numbers are up because they don't want to contract the disease, and people are dying there as well. Now, there's 4 areas where statistically it's proven that the death rates are higher in those areas than normal and indicating more than double in some instances. So I haven't mentioned the stress-related disorders that are actually causing heart attacks, cardiovascular failure, whatever it else might be, the sugar diabetes sufferers. I haven't mentioned any of that. I've only mentioned those 4, but that's where many of the excess deaths are coming from, and it's reasonable to expect that the measures of lockdown in restrictions are causing more deaths than COVID itself, in which case we've got 3 possible considerations. They're incompetent and they don't know how to count. Well, Jacob Zuma doesn't know how to count, but Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma apparently does. She's in charge of the Command Council, so we hope that she can count. Well, if she can count, or maybe she can't. So that's 1. They're incompetent. Option 1. Number 2, they're not incompetent. They know exactly how many are there, but they're just not reporting it, in which case they're lying to South Africans. That's option 2. The other option is that the numbers they're actually counting correctly and accurately. However, we've got more excess deaths than what the disease is calling, and the measures are absolutely incorrect. Those are the only 3 alternatives that we now actually have. I'm going to be called a conspiracy theorist for mentioning the facts of what's actually happening and questioning the measures that are being put in place. I think we have the right to question, especially when the evidence is displaying the same stats that I called a year ago would happen are starting to manifest. We can't now just say it's because the government's incompetent, because it now suits the argument of the people who told me that I was a conspiracy theorist when I told them that the government was incompetent and doing this incorrectly, and it's possibly even malicious. You can't win both sides of that argument. If I flip a coin, you have to choose one side, heads or tails, but you can't have them both. It's just not soccer. My name is Dean Haystack, and I'm just a guy who gives a damn.
My name is Dean Haystack, the Dean, and you're listening to The Coffee Conversation.